And, of course, they in contention there with that triple crown for the Yankees team that won the AL East and reached the ALCS. But that was the end of the history. But when it comes to largest contracts, Judge landing in this ballpark here, the third largest deal we've seen over time in the history of the league, right behind Mike Trout, who had $426.5 there, and Mookie Betts. You can find Aaron Judge there now, staying in the Bronx and in NY in pinstripes the next 9 years. All right, joining me now, the host of Nothing Personal, David Samson. And David, we just talked about yesterday these monster deals. Aaron Judge, the top free agent this offseason. Your reaction to 9 years, $360 million heading his way?
What happened yesterday, let's make sure all the viewers understand. There was a rumor that he had agreed to a deal with the Giants last night. Then there was a rumor that the Giants had offered $360 million. Who do you think is spreading these rumors? Brilliant by Judge and his agents to make sure that the Yankees saw what would happen if he had gone to the Giants. It was mayhem in New York. People were despondent, calling Hal Steinbrenner the worst owner ever. Guess what happens in a matter of 12 hours? All of a sudden, they matched and agreed to $40 million a year for 9 years. This is a 5-year player. Aaron Judge is not going to be good for 9 years. It's not going to work that way. He's not going to have 62 home runs a year for the next 9 years. It's not going to work that way. But there was such pressure to keep their own player that they gave him $40 a year for 9. No one in the industry thinks this is a reasonable deal. And by the way, worse than that, the Yankees didn't get better today. They just didn't get worse.
You mentioned, of course, there that type of money for 9 years at his age, maybe not ideal there. I'm curious, if we're looking at Brian Cashman's route, he mentioned that the numbers that they had put out there before we saw these numbers today, that it was more than a 217 we saw on opening day. How much of this was he kind of pressured, as we talked about before, these GMs pressured to throw this money out there?
Yeah, just so you know, this is an ownership deal. Brian Cashman does not make the decision to go 360 over 9 to Aaron Judge. He is doing whatever Hal Steinbrenner wants him to do, and Hal Steinbrenner simply couldn't handle looking at the back pages of the New York papers, couldn't handle what his legacy would be if he let Aaron Judge go. I draw your attention to the St. Louis Cardinals, such a beautifully run organization. They let Albert Pujols walk, who is a far better player than Aaron Judge, and he went to the Anaheim Angels, which ended up being a horrific contract for the Angels. You've got to be so careful when you're doing deals like this, whether it was Pujols or Cano, because you end up suffering. You suffer later in those deals. Even the Yankees have a hard time overcoming too many large money bad contracts. All of that said, hats off to Aaron Judge and his representatives for understanding how to bet on yourself, then actually doing it, and then manipulating the market to your benefit to the tune of an extra $147 million. Good for him. Aaron Judge is staying with the Yankees.
Hanging off there, as you mentioned, $40 million, 9 years, $360, the third largest deal in MLB. As you see the numbers there, you got Scherzer and Verlander there. You see it when it comes to Judge. I want to bring in Jim Bowden, who's out west, by the way, for those meetings. And Jim, of course, you were hearing all this rumbling in person out there. Your reaction to what we're seeing with Aaron Judge, 9 years, $360?
Yeah, look, I thought Aaron Judge was going to get 8 years, $330 million, so he gets a little bit north of that here. I think the numbers are expected. I think, as David said, this contract will not end well. It will end up the same way that Miguel Cabrera's did, and Albert Pujols and Joey Votto's and Robinson Cano's. It just won't end well. But the Yankees got their player, and I think a lot of credit should go to the agents representing Aaron Judge and Judge himself, because they handled this negotiation so well. I really felt like up until about noontime yesterday, I felt 85% sure that Judge was going to go back to New York. I kept listening to everything he had said during free agency. He always talked about winning being the most important thing to him, and his legacy of spending his whole career with the Yankees. And I trust that everything he says is truthful based on his history. That being said, yesterday when the fake news broke that he had agreed with the San Francisco Giants and then it was quickly retracted back, I think that put the fear of God in Brian Cashman and Hal Steinbrenner's mind. The fact that the story was leaked out that the Giants had $360 million on the table, and then was leaked out that he was going to go there, and then there started being multiple reports, including comments from Giants players off the record he was going to go there. I think the Yankees understood that that was a message coming from Judge's camp indirectly. And I think they sat there, they saw the message, and jumped in and paid and made sure that they made an offer that was exactly the same as what the Giants had on the table. So I think great job of negotiating by Judge's camp.
One of the hardest things to do when you are an executive, and I know, Jim, you will agree with this, is to deal with the outside pressure, the outside rumors, and then to deal with your owner. Because what Hal Steinbrenner did here, he cannot have done it with Brian Cashman's loving approval. And normally GMs are okay saying, hey, if you want to go out extra years, I may not be here anyway. Brian Cashman's been there 25 years. He knows that the future comes faster than you think. When you sacrifice later years for early years, you want that payoff. But I think it's important to note here, as brilliant as it was for Judge, and it was, and I said that too, Jim, it's so hard to let one of your own players go, even when it's the right decision to let that player go. And when you're the Yankees, you feel like you have to operate differently, that it is a bigger problem when you don't re-sign an Aaron Judge. Well, I don't agree with that. It's not like they're the three-time defending champions. Oh, by the way, the defending champion Braves let Freddie Freeman go. And Freddie Freeman, I could argue pretty persuasively, is a better player than Aaron Judge. There's always ways to make your team better. One player does not a championship make. And what the union does that is so spectacular is they keep raising the bar for the top end of salaries in the hopes that it will drag up everybody in the bottom and the middle. And when you see what some of these pitchers make, like when Walker is making $17 or $18 million, or Tyone is making $17 or $18 million, that's because the top end is now at 35 or 40 or 43. Just brilliant work by the union, brilliant work by the negotiators and by Aaron Judge, because when you know someone's weakness, go after it. And Hal Steinbrenner had a weakness. He didn't want to get embarrassed.
Okay, now let's talk about what's next, David, because the Giants are planning now to jump in on the Carlos Correa sweepstakes. They're going to pivot off a Judge now and try to get one of these shortstops in the market. They're also trying to bring Carlos Rodon back, the left-handed pitcher. Correa's market has been fascinating. The Minnesota Twins have on the table a deal that's over $300 million. I didn't think that would come from Minnesota. Now the Giants have a chance to go out there and top that deal. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Giants pivot. Now, from the Yankees' perspective, they're not done. This was never about just doing Judge. They are in the process of negotiating with Brandon Nimmo and Andrew Benintendi with the hopes of getting one of them back to play left field next year. They're also working on other relievers. They signed Tommy Kahnle back yesterday, but they're also in the market trying to upgrade that bullpen as well. So this is just the beginning for the Yankees. And for the Giants, their pivot and how they're going to spend their money is going to be fascinating because I wouldn't be surprised if they jump into something as early as today.
David, I'm curious too, and Jim and you both kind of touched on this a little bit, and you said they really didn't get better. They just kept, honestly, their best bat there on the roster. Big picture here, how much Fast and the Furious are we going to see from the Yankees? Jim just touched on it a little bit, but if you're in that seat, you got to kind of move the ball rolling now if you're adding some more pieces to contend again for a title.
Well, they contend every year, so make no mistake, Brian Cashman gets them in the playoffs every year. They have successful regular seasons. I think that we said from the beginning that they needed better pitching, deeper pitching in their rotation, and that was going to be a way to get through October. They've been fantastic at getting to October, but never through it. So Brian Cashman, of course, has to keep going, but he couldn't really do anything other than on the margins until he knew about Aaron Judge, because at the end of the day, there are luxury tax implications for going over these thresholds, and the Yankees are going over these thresholds like they don't even exist, as are a bunch of other teams like the Phillies, like the Mets, like the Padres. What Jim said, and it's so important to note, is the pivot concept. The pivot concept is music to the ears of agents, and it is nightmarish nails on a chalkboard for executives. Because what the pivot concept is we riled up our fan base. They thought we were getting Aaron Judge. Mitch Haniger is like an afterthought. By the way, he may be just as good as Judge. Not as exciting, but he may be just as good overall next year. We'll wait to see at only, let's say, $15 million a year and not 40. But the pivot is now we've got to sign Correa. We've got to do something. And when you're an owner or a president and you tell your GM you must do something, you end up with Edwin Jackson on a 5-year deal with the Cubs.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.